I now give the floor to His Excellency Sameh Hassan Shoukry Selim, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Your Excellency Ambassador Chaba Karachi, President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, allow me to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the current session of the Assembly. We wish you all the success in presiding over the Assembly's work. Ladies and gentlemen, the current session of the General Assembly is taking place at a very delicate historical moment. As we are witnessing a myriad of intertwined crises of enormous complexity. This requires concerted and serious action and a renewed commitment to multilateralism, first and foremost under the umbrella of the United Nations. While the world is still reeling from the huge repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic and its negative impact, we have witnessed successive geopolitical crises that have ignited international tensions to unprecedented levels. Thus, in light of these delicate circumstances, Egypt presents its vision of the current international scene and means to confront today's challenges. Firstly, the UN system is still facing challenges to circumvent its abilities, despite the fact that it can reach an effective international position, if there is will, that would maintain international peace and security and promote the development and prosperity of the countries of the world. Regrettably, we have lost hope in achieving a peaceful world in the 21st century, rejecting tensions, a world where we could have established an order underpinned on the rules of international law. Instead, we were facing a world overshadowed by increased polarization, confrontation, and conflict. Instead of thriving for complementarity to achieve common interests or even compete on fair rules to contribute to the progress of humanity at large. Circumventing the UN system is not limited to working outside its framework. It even threatens to adopt double standards in addressing similar crises. What is accepted in a particular crisis is considered totally off the table in another crisis. Thus, the flaws are not a feature of the UN system itself, rather in the will of the parties to that system. As we meet in September of every year in this global forum, I call upon all those gathered to respect the UN system and reinvigorate it and work on reforming it. This process should not be left incomplete or follow an endless process. Instead, it should be achieved seriously with objectivity and fairness so that the United Nations can better respond to the challenges we face and more flexible in meeting the demands and needs of our people. In this regard, Egypt reiterates its respect to the African position calling for the reform of the Security Council based on the Eswatini Consensus and the CERT Declaration. Mr. President, the Russian-Ukrainian crisis has further exacerbated the economic crises faced by the entire world since the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic's devastating negative impact, coupled with the successive geopolitical crises, has led the developing countries to face increasing burden, especially when it comes to the sovereign debts and the growing public deficits. Hence, there is need for the developed countries to respond to the call for the launch of a global initiative between creditor and debtor countries to transform the bulk of the debt into joint investment projects. This would create more job opportunities and contribute to positive economic growth. Ladies and gentlemen, the current international situation indicates clearly that the global order is now closer to a system of a balance of power rather than collective security. The predominant international scene is more of a conflict rather than cooperation. Therefore, we must work to promote the spirit of international consensus to guarantee the security of all countries without threatening or undermining any country's security or interests. The current global challenges threaten at times the very notion of a nation-state. It leads to the interference in their internal affairs and a lack of respect to the specificities of the different societies. This weakens the state entities and sometimes even undermine it, which allows non-state actors such as terrorist groups or armed militias to control the destinies and treasures of states. This must end up by allowing the national institutions to undertake all their jobs which would preserve peace and security on the international scale. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, there are numerous complex challenges on the international scene that have so many complex repercussions, including the current food crisis. This crisis is the result of many years of failure of the international community to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, especially the goals aiming at eradicating hunger and ensuring food security. This comes in addition to the latest economic and geopolitical crises. Unfortunately, in Africa alone, 1 in every 5 persons are at risk of hunger, and the continent remains a net food importer at an annual cost of $43 billion. In this vein, we reiterate the need to address this crisis through an integrated strategy that tackles its root causes. First, we need to develop sustainable farming and food systems and meet the urgent needs of food importing developing countries. We must ensure that those products would participate in the global supply chain without any hindrance by developing and transferring agricultural technologies. It is of equal importance to support the early warning systems when it comes to food insecurity and develop grain storage and import. In this context, Egypt, thanks to its unique geographical location, announces its readiness to cooperate with the international community to establish an international hub for storing, supplying, and trading grains in Egypt. This would contribute to maintaining global food security. Mr. President, the current session of the General Assembly is taken under a theme that reflects our deep understanding of the problems and challenges facing the world today. Undoubtedly, that title, The Collective Search for Innovative Solutions to Complex and Interrelated Crises, is mostly applicable to the climate change crisis. Egypt, in its capacity as the coming president of the 27th session of the Conference of State Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, appeals to all members of the international community. Let us act on our pledges and commitments and support the developing countries and the LDCs in their efforts to confront the devastating impact of climate change. They are the most deserving of such support based on the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities. Thus, we look forward during the COP27 hosted by Egypt in a few weeks to reach outcomes that would contribute in accelerating the pace of implementation across all boards so that the international community would confirm its commitment in addressing climate change, including reducing emissions, enhancing mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, and more importantly, raising ambitions in climate financing. We must work and committing to doubling the finance of adaptation and guaranteeing $100 billion annually and a just transition to renewable energy. The ability of the international community to move forward in implementing the Paris Agreement goals, especially limiting the rise in global temperature, is closely linked to the concrete outcomes of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. This would demonstrate to all our peoples that confronting climate change remains an important priority on the global scene, despite all the challenges confronting today's world. In this vein, Egypt reaffirms that it will spare no effort in providing all favorable conditions to achieve such an outcome. Mr. President, water security remains one of the most important challenges facing our world today, especially in the Middle East and the African continent. For some of Africa's countries are located in some of the driest and most arid countries in the world. Unfortunately, this grave human suffering is not necessarily due to a lack of resources or declining rainfall. Instead, it could be the result of the irrespect of the rules of international law and the attempt of some countries, some upstream riparians, to monopolize the water resources, which deprive downstream countries of the water that flows as a common good for all, for it should be available to all. Those who misinterpret resorting to peaceful means to settling water disputes is a form of weakness. Instead, it stems from a strong position and an ability to protect and preserve rights so that they are not lost or alienated. It is based on a keen awareness of the negative impact of such conflicts on people before governments. Thus, Egypt, which recognizes the right of the Ethiopian people to development and remains for more than an entire decade committed to self-restraint, stresses that this will not and will never mean that we will let go of the right of Egyptians to the water of Nile, which has been a right to life. It has always been part of its history. I reiterate the need to reach without delay a comprehensive, legally binding agreement regarding the filling and functioning of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, in line with the agreement reached by Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia in March of 2015 in Khartoum, and the presidential statement issued by the Security Council on the 15th of September 2021. Those three sovereign states must respect their obligations. They must implement it in words, in deeds, not just words, to maintain international peace and security. Thus, we call upon the international community, represented by the UN and the Security Council and all interest countries, to implement the relevant rules of international law to maintain the rights of and fate of more than 250 million Egyptian and Sudanese and Ethiopian citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, resolving Definitely, the multiple crises in our region remains an essential pillar in building a secure and stable international order. Foremost, the need to reach a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution based on negotiation to the Palestinian issue, based on decisions of international legitimacy, and the two-state solution to establish a Palestinian state along the lines of the June 4th, 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. We must refrain from any unilateral measures that would change the facts on the ground and undermine chances for a final solution. Stemming from Egypt's responsibility to support our neighbors, we continue our effort to reach political solutions in accordance with international terms of references with Syria, in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Sudan, to preserve the unity, integrity, and sovereignty of these brotherly countries and end any external interference in their affairs. In this vein, Egypt continues to support the efforts of our neighbors in Libya to implement the constitutional framework, which would enable them to organize presidential and parliamentary elections simultaneously as soon as possible, on the hope of reaching the final stage. In this vein, we commend the role of the elected Libyan parliament and stress the need for the withdrawal of all foreign forces and mercenaries from Libya and to dismantle all armed militias within a specific time frame, which would ensure the restoration of the desired stability in Libya. Our region has long suffered, and it's high time to put an end to this suffering and uphold the interests of its people instead of the parochial, political, and personal interests. We must put an end to anyone attempting to undermine our region's unity and national security. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding, I would like to highlight the importance of solidarity as a very fundamental value that we are in dire need for at the current stage. The UN's designation of an International Day for Human Solidarity on the 20th of December of every year indicates the importance of encouraging new initiatives to eradicate poverty and celebrate unity in the context of diversity. This is a clear indication that the UN system believes in solidarity as an indispensable value, not only to effectively achieve the SDGs, but also to counter the emerging challenges and address the gaps in economic development. The value of solidarity will remain a source of hope and a desire and a belief in a better tomorrow that will never be achieved unless we all act together, hand in hand, to build and put away all evil in the hope of coexistence and cooperation under the banner of humanity and fraternity. Thank you very much, and we wish you all a successful session.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the last speaker.